So we thought, before I launch into questions, I want to give you a sense of the book and a sense of the beginning of the story. Imagine you're in 1468. A young priest called Christopher Fairfax has been sent to a remote village in Exmoor to conduct the funeral of the parish priest. He arrives in the dark on horseback. The late priest's housekeeper lets him in, gives him a meal of stewed rabbit's heart and ale, then leads him to his bedroom by the light of 2 homemade candles. In the middle of the night, he wakes up. He begins to explore the study in which he's been put to bed. He realizes that the priest was obsessed with the past. And in the corner of the room, there's a cabinet. Does that lead on?
Yes, that leads on very well. Thank you. You should be writing the novels rather than me, I think. So yes, 1468, and the priest looks at this display cabinet. This was chest-high, wood-framed, with a front of glass. Ancient glass, he could tell, because it was completely clear and smooth, with none of the rippling effect produced by modern glazing. It was cracked in the top right-hand corner. The shelves were also made of the finest glass, and by the light of the candle, the objects they supported seemed to hover magically in mid-air. All of them it was illegal to possess. Coins and plastic banknotes from the Elizabethan era, keys, gold rings, pens, glassware, a plate commemorating a royal wedding, thin metal canisters, a bundle of plastic straws, a plastic swaddler with faded images of storks carrying infants, white plastic cutlery, plastic bottles of all shapes and varieties, toy plastic bricks all fitted together of vibrant yellows and reds, a spool of greenish-blue plastic fishing line, a plastic flesh-coloured baby from which the eyes were missing, and on the topmost shelf, propped up on a clear plastic stand, what seemed to be the pride of the collection, one of the devices used by the ancients to communicate. Fairfax had seen fragments of them before, but never one in such a perfect state of preservation. He felt drawn to it, and this time, despite himself, he couldn't resist opening the cabinet and taking it out. It was thinner than his little finger, smaller than his hand, black and smooth and shiny, fashioned out of plastic and glass. It weighed quite heavy in his palm, pleasingly substantial. He wondered who had owned it and how the priest had come by it. What images might it once have conveyed? What sounds might have emerged from it? He pressed the button on the front, as if it might miraculously spring to life, but the glossy surface remained resolutely black and dead, and all he could see was the reflection of his own face, ghostly in the candlelight. He turned it over. On the back was the ultimate symbol of the ancients' hubris and blasphemy, an apple with a bite taken out of it.
Talk about successful branding.
I haven't yet heard from the Apple Corporation.
When I was reading the book, I got a review copy. I'd read none of the reviews that maybe you've read. I didn't know what it was about. And it was a jaw-dropping moment of realization where you just thought, oh my God, we are in the future. We're not in the past. And as it turns out, the calendar has been reset, which is why 1468 is actually, as you slip in, 1468, the year of our risen Lord, not Anno Domini, Anno Domini. And so it's incredibly exciting. And what I wanted to know was, what's it like writing that passage?
Well, it was one of those moments where I thought I just had him wandering around this room and what he might see, and then I suddenly, only really at that moment, I realised that, of course, this is all about the Armageddon, really, and the loss of our technical civilization. And suddenly, it hadn't struck me until that moment that the device, which in many ways is what causes the collapse of civilization, is actually a reference to the Garden of Eden and the dangers of having too much knowledge. I mean, it is quite extraordinary that they should have chosen that symbol. And at that moment, I thought this book was fated to be written. So I immediately put it in.
But you're so well known for being a thriller writer and for making us turn the page. And do you actually plot these moments to lead us up to the excitement? Do you kind of get a kick thinking, I'm going to make the audience gasp? Or are you also writing in an excited fashion?
Well, things like that you don't realise until you get to it. It reminds me of there's a moment in Fatherland where you keep saying that President Kennedy is coming to meet the Führer. And then, of course, I suddenly realised, of course, I'd have to make it Joseph Kennedy rather than John F. Kennedy. Those sorts of little jokes are quite nice to play, but you don't plan them. They just occur to you when you reach them. I do, though, I do obviously plot a book relatively carefully, because otherwise I wouldn't know what I was doing.
And are you plotting it out? How are you plotting it on plain paper with post-it notes? What does it look like?
I just sort of make a kind of 2-3 page bullet point sort of summary of what the book might be. I learned to do this right at the beginning. I started writing Fatherland I can't remember the exact year, probably about 1989, I think, 3 years before it was published. And the first page of Fatherland is the first page of fiction I ever wrote. You know, the body in the lake, the rain, pulling it out. And then I thought, oh, and the body has only one leg. And so I put that in. And then they drove back through the rainy morning to the central Berlin, to the criminal police headquarters, and a band passed rehearsing for Hitler's 75th birthday parade. This is great. Got them into the headquarters. I'm making this up as I go along. They get into the criminal police headquarters. There's about 6 or 7 men in the room. Why are they there? And I didn't know why they were there, and they didn't know why they were there. So the whole book stopped, and literally I had to put it away for a year. I thought, well, because I thought, how on earth can one write a novel? I was just trying to make it up as I went along. And then I read an article by John Irving, the American novelist, who said, you have to know the end before you can start, otherwise you're simply lying. And it's true, a novel describes, there are many ways of writing a novel, but essentially a novel describes something that's already happened. So there's the incident, the thing, and then you have to decide as the writer how you will tell this story. First person, third person, present tense, past tense, whatever. But there's 2 distinct phases of creation. And so I learned that. And then I took my guys in the room and worked out why they might be there and plotted it to the end, and then started writing it, and then it all made sense. It's rather like if you embark on writing a novel without knowing the ending, it's like embarking on telling a joke without knowing the punchline. So,
disastrous.
Yes.
So in this book, so Second Sleep, it's the most miserable portrait of the future you can imagine. There is no sanitation, no medicine, no science. We're back in what feels a bit like the Dark Ages. Except, to make it even worse, the countryside is scattered with the bits of our detritus, our plastic, even our stately homes standing ruined just to remind them of how awful we were. And to top it off, it happens in 2025, the collapse of our civilization. So 6 years' time, and apparently we're all going to either starve, die of disease, or be massacred, and then the few survivors will presumably create the people.
It's a Brexit novel, in other words.
Well, maybe that's the answer to my question, which is, why are you doing this to us?
Well, it's a dystopia and a satire, and so you have to push things to the absolute extremes, as happens in all such novels. I don't necessarily think this is going to happen, it's just, at all, but it's just a sort of fantasy pushed to the furthest extent. I'd written novels about ancient Rome, Pompeii, and the novels about Cicero, which meant that I read a lot of work of archaeologists and scholars who pieced together family trees and what the past was like from fragments of papyri, tomb inscriptions, and so on. And as I found that whole process fascinating to see how they did it. And it made me think, what would happen in 1,000 years if people were trying to piece together our civilization? What would they make of it? What would they make of us? What has happened to us that we're no longer here? And so that was the starting point of the novel, that sort of idea. And it seemed last year the time had come to write it. And I don't know whether that's because there's a certain anxiety in the air, not just here, but around the world, a sense of things, solid institutions starting to melt beneath our feet. At any rate, it seemed a good time to do it.
But is there a sense of a call to action? Are you being a Greta Thunberg, kind of saying, do something?
I think I make a strange Greta Thunberg. I think that, well, I am worried. A couple of incidents that have occurred, you know, the tanker driver strike in 2000, the financial crash in 2008. In both cases, the one experienced the petrol shortages and so on, and in the case of the financial crash, which I followed with interest, there was a genuine fear that ATMs would run out of money, in which case the knock-on effects would have been truly disastrous. And a friend who was called in from the city to work on emergency planning in the Treasury, he said that the first 2 weeks were spent talking about the emergency distribution of food. It just brings home to you how interconnected our economy is, and it gets more and more so. So any interruption in the things, the sinews that keep our world going is potentially calamitous. And it's not as if technology is reliable or that there aren't governments plotting this form of warfare. Cyber warfare is potentially much more devastating for us than the Luftwaffe in the war, say, because the cliche being that London's only 6 meals away from starvation at any one time because all our food is on the roads. So to that extent, I think I'm not necessarily warning everyone like a sort of Old Testament prophet, but I'm saying, hey, just think about this for a second, you know, because if your phone packs in on Monday, where will you be by Thursday?
My phone packed in actually the other day, and because of that double verification for emails, I couldn't get any emails because I tried to get onto my email. It said, I'll send your phone a text message. Yeah. I didn't have a phone. It was a nightmare. And you really realise you're completely sunk.
And it's not only your present contacts, for instance, which are lost. It's your past, your photographs, your videos, your correspondence. All the great moments of your life are probably held, who knows where they are, a cloud or... You know, so I think that is, insofar as novelists are supposed to reflect these kind of tremors in the air, that's the purpose of the book. Yes, definitely, in a way.
You do say of the mobile phone, you say, this is a historian in the book talking about the past, saying, in due course, they displaced human memory and reasoning and even normal social intercourse, an enfeebling and narcotic power that some say drove their possessors mad, to the extent that their introduction marked the beginning of the end of advanced civilization.
Yes. Well, I had a lot of fun writing the book, as you can imagine. Yes, he was a wonderful character to be able to deploy, an antiquarian like John Aubrey, making wild stabs and thinking about what our society was like and how it had gone wrong, sometimes getting it right, sometimes getting it wrong.
But do you hate the mobile phone?
Well, no, well, I love it, like we all do. That's the trouble. And actually, you see, we call it a mobile phone, but that is a misnomer. It's really your life. It's a powerful computer you're carrying around with you. It's not really, most of us, the phone is the last thing we use it for. I mean, I'll give you a small example. This morning, as I was on the train coming to Taplow, I read Philip Hammond's article in the Times, in which he said that Boris Johnson was pursuing a hard Brexit in part because of his backers in the city who would lose a fortune if there wasn't a hard Brexit because they're shorting the pound. Well, gosh. I took a photograph of it and tweeted it. And just before I came in here, I looked, and it had been seen by 170,000 people. So that is on the train journey coming in here. This is not a phone we're carrying around with us. This is like a bomb. And the potential, the power of this, I don't think we appreciate, and its effects upon us as individuals, what we can do, the way we think, and what it's doing to our institutions, to the way that our democracy is run. I don't think we even scratched the surface of what it's doing.
I'm aware that you took on a very challenging project here, thinking about the future. And in all your books, you're famous for doing all the research into the Romans and into the Germans. And in Fatherland, you did have Speer's plan for what Berlin would be like. Here you had nothing. You're just working out what's going to happen. How did you research it? Did you research it?
It was hell. I mean, I had to make it up. Who knew? Yes, well, I've always been haunted by Thomas Hardy's novels, the portrait of Wessex, and so the novel is set in Wessex, and so that was one thing. And the journals of Kilvert, Francis Kilvert, I'm an obsessive reader of journals, and those are amazing. This 19th century young cleric who's dumped near Hay-on-Wye in a tiny village, and the isolation and the sense of nature, powerful, empty skies and empty fields. That was useful. A very good book by Eamon Duffy called The Voices of Moor Bath, which is all about a tiny village in Exmoor at the beginning of the 16th century that's hit by the Reformation, and the church has to lose its icons and so on. But more than that was the way that the church was at the very centre of existence, social, educational, everything was through the vicar and the church. So there were these things that...
So you are setting the future in the past?
Yes, because it's part of my... I don't believe that we change very much, and that we would revert to similar pattern if something did happen, that we wouldn't go into some strange way of existence unfamiliar to humanity. We would revert to a previous mode of existence based around small communities, and probably with the church once again fulfilling the role that it's always filled of answering the eternal questions and providing succor and education and social contact. So I think we would revert to something like that. I don't believe we'd go off and suddenly become a different species. We would live as we used to live.
It brings us nicely on to the church, which is the villain in this book. It feels, what you've just said about it, it's all very positive, but in the book it's forcing people to speak the King James Bible, it's suppressing the truth about the past. It's illegal to look into the past, and that's why it's a thriller, because they're doing something very dangerous, trying to work out what happened. I just wondered why why has the church got to be a baddie again?
Well, it's not so much that I think the church is a baddie, as I think that power inevitably goes somewhere. And in this world, the church occupies the role of, say, the party in 1984. It is simply the collection of the people that control the society. And the fact that the King James Bible foretold Armageddon and is sitting there in these churches, which incidentally would be some of the few buildings which would last. I mean, most modern buildings will not last, the churches will. So it seemed to me to sort of tie together. I'm not anti-clerical at all, but in this particular case, I thought it was important. And I was very struck by a comment Evelyn Waugh made about 1984, because Waugh, they met shortly before Waugh's death. Waugh used to visit him in his sanatorium at Stroud, and so Orwell gave him an advance copy, and Waugh read it and said that it was a very powerful book, but he utterly disagreed with it because it left out the church entirely, and he said, ignore the supernatural aspect if you will, but I don't believe that the church will disappear in the way that you say it does. And I think that was absolutely right, and I think that that's been borne out in the last few years. So I wanted to restore, if you like, the church to its central role in a dystopia.
But you felt it would be anti-science, anti-progress?
Well, that's certainly what the Catholic Church used to be. Another book that influenced me a lot years ago was Kingsley Amos's The Alteration. I don't know how many know that, but that imagines a world in which the Reformation never took place. And there are no cars, everything's horse and cart and so on, because the church regarded heretical scientific progress, Galileo, challenging anything that was in the Bible. So I think intellectually it coheres that view.
It does give you a bit of a challenge, though, because is it the Catholic or the Anglican Church? The buildings that survive would be Anglican.
Well, the Catholics would say they were Catholic and had been taken over by Anglican interlopers. I think that in my world, the king is the head of the church, and I don't think we'd wind back the Henrician Reformation and start reintroducing the Pope. But the nature of the religion is far more like old style Catholicism, with particular saints, for particular sections of society. And it's much more, it's not at all like the milk and water modern Anglican faith. This is, heretics are burned, and so it's a much stronger controlled form of religion.
It's impossible not to think this is your second book about religion. Are we going into a religious vein?
Well, I hope not. I mean, it's purely by accident, and in each case, I mean, I do find interesting. I mean, my favourite novelists are Catholic, I realise, Warren Green and Brian Moore. And I think there's something about that conflict between the world and faith, which interests me a lot. But both Conclave and this novel are really about power more than they are about dogma, let's say.
What's your own background, religious upbringing?
None. My parents, my father, who had been confirmed, nevertheless had become a staunch atheist by the time I was born, so I was never even christened. A thing I came mildly to resent, as I felt that it's much easier to be hooked up to the utilities before, in childhood, rather than to try and get to them later. If I now wanted to be christened, there'd be a hell of a palaver of professing faith and so on. I'd just like to have had it all switched on at the beginning so that I didn't have to make the choice. I mean, I am really an agnostic. I just think that life would be rather dull if one only believed, if one didn't have some space in one's head for some kind of sense of wonder, if you like.
Do you find that in churches? I mean, do you go to churches, go to church?
My religion is probably the past. I mean, I have a very strong connection and feeling for the past. I think that's so well conveyed in Hardy, that sense that beneath the soil and the hills are the shapes of generations that have gone hundreds of generations before ours. And that gives me some form of dimension that is beyond what you just see now. I find it very powerful to think of that. And so all my novels, in a way, I get most excited about that sense that the years fall away and you can feel what it might have been like to be a water engineer in Pompeii, or to be Cicero facing the mob, or to be Colonel Picard in Paris in the 1890s. That is the thing that I most enjoy doing. And of course, I know Dawkins would joke, laugh at this sort of pretentious, weak feeling, but nevertheless, that does give me an almost religious sense, I think.
I was really thrilled to see that the churches and cathedrals all remain, and all the 21st century glass and steel has just disappeared. It just gets completely wiped out. I mean, it's thrilling that the good stuff is here. The Barrett homes have gone.
Well, yeah, it's not so much those. It's the great skyline, that bombastic City of London skyline, strutting, actually would only last 100, 150 years. Yeah. It would all fall down. And the motorways, my God, think of the M4, they're bad enough now. Within 30 years, they would just be forests. I mean, nature would reclaim us very, very, very quickly, our civilization. And I've always been struck by the way that the Romans left Britain in 451 AD and left behind this incredible infrastructure, which of course fell into decay because after a while no one could use it, or make it work, or wasn't necessary. So that 300 years on, there's a Saxon poem, the poet comes upon a big Roman villa in the middle of a wood, decaying. But the Roman buildings, the Roman roads, they lasted a lot longer than things that we've made. The Mulvian Bridge in Rome, for instance, which is in which is where Cicero intercepted the Catiline conspirators, the bridge is still in use, and it's a Roman bridge. And anyone who's seen the Pantheon, a building that modern civil engineers couldn't make. They don't know how it manages to stand up.
And it's so beautiful.
Yeah, an incredible building.
Fairfax is the priest, and he's a wonderful character. He's a character who goes on a big emotional journey. To begin with, he's a bit of a lackey, he's young, he's ambitious, he seems to have faith, he wants to do the right thing. And then he comes across this truth about the past. And he's on that pivotal moment of, which way does he go? Does he go with the truth, or does he stick with the church? And I noticed that this isn't the first time you've had a character who kind of is part of an institution, and then something happens and they have to make a decision and they go with the truth. Does that resonate? Is that something that matters to you? Essentially,
I've written the same book again and again. I just simply shifted it from period to period. No, it is. That is my. I constantly go to that figure. That's the first hero of the first book, the detective who uncovers the crime that has in fact been committed by the state. That is Colonel Picard in the Dreyfus novel. That figure interests me because, and it's an obvious, compelling fictional figure because you're inside the institution, you discover something, that's interesting, then a moral dilemma, how will it play out? It's a natural story. But not only that, it resonates every single day in the newspapers in the world we live in. Think of the whistleblower now with Trump and his call to the Ukrainian president. Who is this person? What risks have they taken? Why did they decide to do that? What will happen to them? It goes on and on. I'm called a thriller writer, which is not a label I object to at all, but a political novelist would be closer to what I am, and politics is just one long thriller, it seems to me. Look at what's going on now.
But why does that character matter to you? Is it what you would like to be? Yes. It who you look up to?
I do look up to that person, and I'm not at all sure that I have the moral strength to do the heroic thing. And I suppose all the novels, in a way, keep probing and making one wonder, how would one have behaved? If the Nazis had come here, how would we have behaved? It's all very well to think we'd have been part of the resistance, but would we? And I often looked around, when I worked for big organisations like the BBC, I looked around and I often used to think if something had happened, which are the ones who would hasten to put on the uniform? And you can look around and you can see them, can't you?
And have you ever been in that position yourself of having to decide, which way do I go, and having to make a decision?
No, not really, because most of my life I've been a freelance, or my life has been devoted to not having a boss, really, and to being able to do what I want. So I have not really been in that position, but I'm endlessly fascinated to think how I would have been. Someone like me, I was born in 1957, so that is 12 years after the end of the war. Which is no time. Now when one thinks what was 12 years ago, that was 2007. So that was the difference in time. And I think anyone who grew up there, everyone had been in the war. And so there was an odd sense I only became conscious of later. It was like something hadn't happened in my life that had happened before, to grandparents and parents' generations. And so I think that started off a kind of wondering how one would have behaved.
Do you wish you'd been in that position?
No, I don't. But nevertheless, I think that ours has been a generation or two or three now that haven't faced anything like the two preceding generations, which is very interesting. And I'm not sure that that's ever happened before. And one of the reasons that things seem so odd and fluid now is, I think, very much because of that. We take for granted peace and the institutions which have seen us through to a degree that we quite now feel like, just kicking it over and seeing what might happen. And I think the older generation would have been more cautious.
There are some really nail-biting moments in this book, and one of the things that's so thrilling is when a character you think is bad turns out to be good, or you think he's good or she's good, it turns out to be bad. Other novelists I've heard say that the characters come to life in their head and the character's leading the story and they don't know what's happening. And do you have this? I never know if it's rubbish that or if it's true, but do you have that? Are they alive in your head, these people?
Well, two myths about writing, in my opinion. One is get an isolated, secluded cottage and go and write there. Fatal. You'll go insane. The main thing in writing is to have almost as easy a domestic routine as possible.
What, someone else doing the cooking? Is that what you're saying? A wife?
You should be a barrister. You completely caught me there. It's probably true. Yeah, but let's move on hastily from that. No, what I mean is a sense of routine and normality, so that you write in the morning and then you forget about it. At least I do for the rest of the day. And you do pick up the children from school, actually, Blanche. So, all that sort of thing. And then the next day you start again refreshed to work. So I think the myth of solitariness is wrong in writing. And the other myth, I think, is, the characters just started, they ran away with the book. Well, it's great if you've created characters and it's very easy to tell what they would say, for instance, because you just say, and you can almost sit back and they are talking because they're solidly realized creations. But I think the idea that, say, a character would suddenly take off with the book, I mean, you would almost be betraying the story you're seeking to tell if that happened, or you'd start writing a totally different book. But it is great when you feel a character is so right and strong that you know what they would say.
You always have very strong female characters, and the men always fall for them and go to bed with them.
Yes, well, it's life, isn't it?
They're good. I mean, they're wonderful, strong female characters. Is it a conscious decision to have strong female characters?
No, in fact, one of the things, I'm glad you should say that, because one of the things I do rather regret is that because of the sort of novels that I write, especially novels set in the past, the truth is that women did not have access to the power in ancient Rome. I mean, they could be powerful behind the scenes, but they weren't really actors, state actors. Or in An Officer and a Spy, it was a very male world of the French army and so on. It was, they were great hostesses, but they weren't actors themselves. So I did like in this novel putting in a strong female character because my life has been full of strong women, to be honest with you. I mean, in publishing, I think I've only ever had female editors. I've worked a lot with women, so I do want to reflect that, not in any kind of politically correct sense, but simply because that is reality.
What was your mother like?
Quiet, actually. My father was much the more dominant member of the family, but my mother was quiet, but woe betide you if you crossed her, and she never forgot or forgave.
And with your characters, do you make a little plot about them? Do you create, how actors, before they go on stage, they really think about every element of that character. Do you do that with your characters?
Yes, I think you need to know quite a lot about them. Not so much that they become sort of almost wooden blocks. I don't tend to describe characters too much, the physical detail, because I think that the reader should have an impression of what a character is like. And one of the great advantages of novels over films, for instance, is that the reader does a lot of the work. And so if I write, he walked along the beach, the pebbles crunching under his feet, the smell of the seaweed and the salt, the hiss of the withdrawing waves, you are filling all that in yourself, doing actually at least half of the work, whereas in the film it's put straight ahead. And the ghost, for instance, in my novel, you can imagine who this Prime Minister might be. I'm not trying to push you anywhere. On screen, it's Pierce Brosnan, and he did very well, but he used to be James Bond. That sort of, for me, that is why, for me, I much prefer novels to film.
And in a sense, having Pierce Brosnan actually ruins the whole joy of knowing it's Blair, doesn't it? Because in your head you know it's Blair. So
Well, you might say that. Well, I couldn't possibly comment. Exactly. And that, I mean, there are great advantages to films, but you certainly lose that subtlety and nuance. And so I don't put a list of clunking, I hope, directions of where a character was educated and so on. I might know that and I might draw on it, but one of the secrets of writing, it seems to me, is to not show the working out, not show the research, not kind of, constantly try to tell people that you've read about this, that and the other, but just to forget that. Know it yourself, convey it, but not linger over it.
Is it in moleskin notebooks? Is it on a computer? Is it on...
Oh, it's in whatever comes to hand, really. But the actual writing is done on a computer. I'm old enough that when I started writing, it was on there were no computers, on a typewriter. But and I think the novels have suffered by word processing. There's no doubt about it. They've got longer and baggier and looser. Whereas if you had to sit there and tap it out, my God, you didn't necessarily want to change it. And it was slower, and there was a noise, and you'd scribble on it. There was a much more tactile relationship with the prose. Now it's shimmering, dot images on the screen, easily cut, click, save. The temptation not to throw anything away. Novels are far too long these days, in my view. Most things can be told in a third of the length.
I was really struck hearing you talk on, I think it was on Desert Island Discs, about becoming a novelist and how Fatherland almost came as a surprise. It was you didn't intend to do a novel to begin with. It became a novel. It was a bestseller. And then you get the impression, suddenly, you're like, my goodness, I've got to recreate myself as a novelist. And you had a bit of a difficult time straight after that, writing your second book.
Yes, I did. The only time I really had writer's block was writing Enigma. I mean, in a way, looking back, I can see writing a novel about a mathematician when I just got an O-level in mathematics. I can see why I found it difficult. But it was a tough time because I wasn't sure why Fatherland had been the success it had been, and I somehow had to write another novel. And novel writing is a lot to do with confidence, I think. I've speeded up as I've got older because there are now all these other books behind me, so that I'm not really going to be totally judged on whatever comes out this year. Though, you can always say, I didn't like this Second Sleep rubbish, but I really like Fatherland or something. So you get more confident, I think, but Enigma was a real struggle.
But you didn't feel more under pressure now because you have had. Do you feel under pressure to produce a bestseller?
Not so much, no. I think I've grown to love writing. When I first did it, it was a terrible strain, hard. A big moment for me was when I was writing Enigma. I read the letters of, oh my God, it's gone out of my head, Raymond Chandler, and he said, I can understand, I've never understood people complaining about the writing process because it is a great privilege and joy to be able to create. And I know that seems a very banal thing, but actually it really struck home to me. And I thought, why on earth am I complaining about this? This is an incredible privilege and I should just enjoy it. And you know that thing, if you relax into something, you often do it much better. If you stop becoming self-conscious. And I think that's another thing, as the years have gone on, I've stopped being so self-conscious about writing.
Why did you keep going, though? Why didn't you just think, I'll just go back to journalism, political journalism?
Well, the money.
I was hoping you'd say that, to be honest. I wanted to check your truthful
Fatherland, I made more money out of Fatherland than I'd made in everything else I'd done all the years before that put together. So that was a purely straightforward reason. I had two young children. I was hardly not going to carry on doing it. But no, that is a facetious answer. I would have carried on doing it even if I hadn't made that much money, I think, because I just, the joy of creating something, actually. And I think the books that I'd written beforehand and the journalism that I'd done, its characteristic was a kind of, not really for me to say, but a kind of drawing in, one thing I've always understood, I think, is how to tell a story, and fiction is the purest form of that. And so I felt the moment I started writing that I'd come home, that I'd arrived at what I was supposed to do. And I wasn't. It was quite a common phenomenon, is the journalist who writes a novel, becomes a bestseller, they may write one or two more and then they stop, because really they're journalists, and often very good journalists. I wasn't that good a journalist, I don't think. And the moment I wrote my first novel, I realized that all along I'd been a novelist who'd earned a living as a journalist. So for me, I discovered what I wanted to do.
But how have you understood how to write a novel, or how to tell a story? Is it innate, or do you think it comes naturally to some people, not others? You don't have to go to UEA.
Well, don't get me started on that. I think to some degree, yes. Just as someone can paint, someone can, which I can't do. Someone can play a musical instrument, which I can't do. Some people will somehow know how to do that, and I don't know. I honestly can't tell you why that should have been, except that all my life, from about the age of 8 or 9, I lived in a very vivid fantasy world of my creating cities and countries, and it was odd form of creativity, like I would make imaginary newspapers. Literally fake news was and the first thing I bought was a typewriter when I was about 12 or 13, had some money, £10 for a Remington typewriter. Just the smell of the typewriter oil and the smell of the ribbon, everything about it I always found magical, really. So that was my world. I was a sort of bookish child, read a lot of fiction, and sort of started to imitate it, I suppose.
And told stories as a child? I mean, made up stories in your head?
Made up stories in my head, yes. Always of this rather strange sort, though, that they were kind of linked to politics in a way, or linked to the real world, and I've not really deviated from that.
One thing that you presumably had to decide as a novelist was what to do about sex scenes. And I'm really struck when I read your novels. There's always one, and nothing really happens. And
you've been talking to my wife, haven't you?
There's always flesh. There's always her flesh meets his flesh, and the sense of how nice that is.
Oh, it's early in the morning, Blanche. Do we have to go through this?
But why does nothing happen?
Well, it does. I mean, it happens, but
why is it left to our imagination?
Because, well, I think if you wanted to write a book that was very graphic and was all about sex, that would be a particular kind of book, and that would overwhelm everything else. Because
you might earn more from that.
Well, I might.
Shades of grey.
Yes, we're all living on the back of that in the publishing house. I think that I think that first of all, I know my limitations as a writer, and I know my patch of ivory, as it were. And for me, it's politics, and it's that world, and it's that interests me more than anything else. Of course, sex interests me, but not necessarily to write about. And if I were to be an incredibly detailed account of sex scenes, then that would be all the book was about. That would be all the character in this book was interested in, is his love for the female character. So I want to, put it in the novel, but not necessarily make it the centre of the novel, is the truth.
I mean, I'm grateful to you, because there's nothing worse. I don't know about you, but there's nothing worse than an embarrassing sex scene in a novel. So I just thought it must be hard as a novelist to decide what to do with it. And maybe, do you think about your children and what they're going to read, or does that not really cross your mind?
No, not really. I'm not embarrassed about writing it. I just think it's incredibly difficult, and very, very few writers are able to bring it off. Yeah. It's so tender and intimate, and as I say, I think to try and get it right, I would just simply have to abandon most of the rest of the book just to concentrate on that aspect of things.
Right, time. Having asked you a tricky question, over to you.
That came from nowhere, believe me. In 30 years of doing these events, I've never had that before.
So I've given you something special.
Yeah.
Right, to the audience, questions. Who has a question they wish to ask? Thank you. There's a lady over there in white. There's a microphone coming your way.
Thank you. I love your novels, and I'm very much looking forward to reading this next one. But I was just wondering, is it only England or the UK who is in this dystopian future, or is it the rest of the world as well?
Well, I envisage it, obviously the novel is very much set in this very tiny corner of England, but it's suggested that this has happened across the whole world because everyone has been struck by this. So the whole world has slipped back into an earlier phase of development. One of the things I feel about the book is that I regret that I didn't make it bigger in a way, or that because I just concentrate on this very narrow aspect of it. And actually it's been bought by a TV company who made Downton Abbey appropriately. And they want to do, if they can, not just this story, but other stories based in this world. And that's a quite interesting idea, because there's lots of things in this that I don't get into. But you could create a totally alternative universe. So I'd be interested to see what they do.
Would you write it?
Well, I'll be involved with the writer, and I think that will be fascinating. I mean, one of the things that's just a paragraph in the novel is that most young men are forced to join the army and fight what's known as the Northern Caliphate, someplace up in the Yorkshire area, where you know there's obviously some terrible kind of religious war going on. I mean, I thought it was an interesting idea, but I didn't stop to explore it. That would be quite interesting to explore.
Thank you. Another question.
I blame the sex questions. You see, everyone had got something they wanted to ask, and now it's all gone out of there.
No, we've got people. There's a lady there. No.
Thank you. I listened to it on Audible, and I thought it was an extraordinary book. The thing that I want to ask you is, why did you choose to investigate the second sleep? Because it's a very unusual idea.
Well, the second sleep, for those who don't know it, is that before industrialization, it seems that, and this is attested in lots of literature across Europe, people used to go to sleep twice. They would sleep from nightfall to about midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. Then they would often actually get up, even socialize, do a chore or eat, and then go for about an hour, and then go back to what was called the second sleep or the morning sleep until dawn. And as I was imagining our world reverting back to the past, I thought that it would be quite interesting to have that sleep pattern come back. I think most of us are probably conscious of this ourselves, that we often wake up in the early hours of the morning. We regard it as an aberration. In the past, they would have regarded it as totally normal and sort of taken it and absorbed it and then and used the time. So the notion of nighttime and sleep and dreaming and wakefulness is in the novel, and it just seemed to me to encapsulate what the book was about, or the structure of the book, that this is an interval of waking before we sleep again, sort of thing. And so that was why I used it, really. The book is odd, I think, in that it is, for me, in that it's not drawn on any actual historical event, and it's a kind of melange of things that are in one's subconscious or one's read, things that I read when I was at university doing English, Hardy and so on. I mean, it's a strange, rather more personal book in a way than anything I've done before.
There's a gentleman here, a question.
Thank you. I think it was a wonderful conversation, sex aside. But I mean, you talked about your fascination with history. Are you sort of historically conscious about yourself and your work? Do you actually read the novels once they're published? Do you have a sort of sense of how your whole oeuvre has developed over time? Is that something that interests you, or you just basically get on with the next one?
I tried really to get on with the next one, because I think it's fatal to be, as I said earlier, to be self-conscious. especially for a writer. I mean, possibly for an actor or someone in that form, you have to be. But I think for a writer, it's quite important not to examine where it's coming from, not to look in the mirror, as it were, metaphorically too much, just to get on and do it. And the question of where you're placed, or the categorization of your work, I try not to think about it, really. I just enjoy the process of writing. If I'm not writing a book, I feel very uneasy and unsettled. I like to have that refuge almost to go to. And as time has gone on, I've liked writing more and more, so I've become more productive. And if I could, I'd like to write a book a year, simply because, you know, how many books do I have left in me? I don't really want to waste the time anymore. Time is so odd when one's in one's 40s, say. The future seems to stretch ahead endlessly. When you get a bit older, you're conscious that, you know, you can just do the mathematics. How many more books is one going to write? So I really just want to put my head down and do it for as long as I can.
Yeah, thank
you. I wanted to ask you something about the heroes that you've developed, and you touched on humanity and how we would behave in different situations. I know that there have been a lot of heroes from the great and the good, the whistleblower type people from Power and Authority. In this novel, it seems that it's a bit more of ordinary folk involved, and I wondered if you were interested in those qualities in different stratas of society, and if you think there are common qualities that you find in those types of people, if that makes sense.
Yes, no, I know what you mean. It's simply the social class or standing of a character is not important to me in any way. By and large, they need to be people with some kind of access to power or information. And therefore, they tend to be, as it were, a colonel in the French army, or a Cambridge mathematician in Bletchley Park. But I mean, the place where anyone would have these dilemmas doesn't matter. It's the dilemma itself and the dramatizing of it that is important.
Thank you. I'm at the back, gentleman with the beard at the back.
Short of a collapse of civilization, which seems like an extreme measure, do you think there's any way to control the drug-like effects of the mobile phone?
I don't know. I only know that I think it is a drug in some ways, and I have 4 children, and certainly some of them are, you can see that there is a definite anxiety has been caused. I think one can trace specifically to the access to information of what everyone is doing, and it's paranoia-inducing problem, I think. What it's doing to our attention spans and so on. I mean, in one sense, it's absolutely marvelous that you can get pretty well all the world's music or literature or knowledge in your hand in an instant, if you know how to work it. I mean, and the signal's all right, but what does that do to us? That must do something to us, and it's no accident, I think, that one hears that so many of the lords of Silicon Valley actually won't let their own children near it. So I don't know where we will end up. I suspect that it will be the great battleground of the future in politics, the regulation. Because if anything I've written about, it's the fact that people want power, and power in the end is about information. And I wonder how much longer it will continue to be unregulated in this way. I'm not sure, and I think there may even be a move among people generally to think that this should be licensed or controlled more. It feels to me like we're in the Wild West era here, and that something may change on that. We will have to wait and see, but it's funny to have written books set in ancient Rome and to have seen so much of what happened in the Roman Republic happening around us. And whenever I'm on Twitter or whatever, I just think I'm in the forum of ancient Rome, and there's like a mob charging from this side to that. There's a craze. Hang this person. Oh, we got the wrong person. Never mind. Straight on to the next thing. It's like a mass crowd with hysteria. And you realise that nothing has changed. All that's changed is the technology and the means and society. What the superstructure around us, but the basic impulses are exactly the same now for a person here as they were for a pleb in the Forum 2,000 years ago. Yeah, scaled up and much more destructive, obviously. And in ancient Rome, obviously, in the end, the structures could not hold. They could not hold against the unscrupulous patrician who directing the plebs against the elite. The thing snapped and broke, and that form of political society disappeared for 1,500 years, the idea that you might have a vote or a say, however curtailed. So those books, I look back and it's odd that I wrote them, actually, I find. And the things that are in them surprise me, actually.
I'm sure it could never happen again.
There was a question. Do you still want to... Someone had their hand up. Yeah, would you like to ask a question? The lady just there.
I was very interested listening to around your influences and the books that you've read in the past. But listening to some of the themes from the novel made me think of a couple of things. One is around the discussion at the moment about rewilding and John Monbiot and the campaign about what happens when we rewild. But also in the science fiction world where post-apocalyptic themes and return to historical living in a very agrarian society have been, I think, explored a number of times. I was just interested to know to what extent you've drawn on those themes.
Well, I've never been a great reader of science fiction, to be honest with you. I do realise that one writer I devoured when I was a child was H.G. Wells. And I think that I think he was quite an influence on me. I mean, the combination of being very engaged with the politics of the time and the world, and yet at the same time this extraordinary imagination. And a novel like The Time Machine is an extraordinary piece of work. It's simultaneously grounded in reality and yet an utter fantasy, and yet amazingly prophetic in its way. One of the great prophetic novels that has ever been written. So I think that he is quite an influence, and that idea that you can write something which seems very grounded, characters on, this book in many ways is very realistic, and yet is utterly fantastical at the same time. And that combination interests me. I don't know much about rewilding, but it suggests to me there's a great story there.
In the Archers.
Yeah, as you introduce the wolves into your woods, they could literally come back to bite you. So it's quite a good story. But I think that this sort of dream of England, and the dream of England that is no longer linked by motorways and no longer with housing estates, has gone back to forest and moor, and in which odd, enormous concrete structures, motorway embankments, cooling towers from power stations just stand, as one of the characters says here, like funerary monuments in the landscape. There is something dreamlike about that, which I think appeals to a lot of us, in our subconscious. I live near, Wiltshire, and that landscape with the stones, the standing stones, Stonehenge, the ancientness of all of that is very powerful.
There's a question just at the front. Here.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation this morning. A lot of authors generally work with themes. If you go to read an author, you'll know generally there's a topic there they like to write about. I find with the books, and I've read quite a few of your books, there's such a diversity in the storyline. you know, the fear index was technology, the, dare I say, Blair, the ghost. Everything is so very different, and that fascinates me. How do you arrive at what you want to write about? Is it just literally drawing from life, or do you have a burning ambition to write on a particular topic? They're enormously diverse, and I really enjoy that. I never know what I'm going to read next from you.
Well, that's kind of you. Thank you. Just something occurs to me that might be a good idea. And I mean, this sort of occurred to me 6 or 7 years ago. And, you know, at any one time, I have 3 or 4 things which might make a story, a novel. And it's just a question of which seems the strongest as the diary clears and I have time to write. So it's quite haphazard. I'm not comparing myself to him, but I've always had a great admiration for Stanley Kubrick, because as a director, he made a First World War drama, he made a satire about nuclear war, he made Barry Lyndon, Clockwork Orange, he made a film about the Vietnam War. I admire that range. And often you get it more with film directors than you do with novelists. I don't know why that is, but I'd find it boring if I just wrote a novel about the same character each time, a detective, a spy, or whatever. I've enjoyed ranging around and doing lots of different things, even though, of course, I know that sometimes sections of your readership get irritated. I mean, there are a lot of people that read my novels will never touch a Roman book. They just don't like the idea of guys in togas, names ending us, you know. They don't want to do it. Equally, I know there's some people who read the Roman books but actually wouldn't really want to read the others. It's curious. You know, what can one do? One just goes on and writes whatever interests one. I know no other way of working, really.
That's a brilliant question to end on. So Robert will be, if you can, you're going to be going out through that door behind you, and then across the way, across the courtyard's a tent, the John Sandow bookshop, where Robert will be signing copies that you have, signing copies of your books. But for now, thank you so much for withstanding an early morning conversation.